You're 12 years old, standing in a bedchamber that smells of incense and fear, and tomorrow you will be bound to a stranger for life. Your hands are trembling, not from cold, but from the weight of understanding something no child should comprehend. Your body, your future, your very existence has just been sold. The contract was signed 3 months ago. You weren't consulted. You were the contract. Outside your window, servants prepare the feast, and somewhere in this vast stone fortress, the family who purchased you is calculating their return on investment. This isn't a nightmare you can wake from. This is marriage. This is survival. And the odds are already stacked against you. Before we dive deeper into this world, I'd love to know where you're watching from, because it's genuinely incredible that a story this dark from centuries ago can connect us across continents today. The year could be 1450, or 1280, or 1390. The location might be England, France, the Italian states, or the Germanic principalities. But the experience, nearly universal across medieval Europe. We've romanticized this era with fairy tales of knights and princesses, but the historical records tell a different story altogether. Court documents, church registries, private letters preserved in monastery archives, and the meticulous accounting ledgers of noble families reveal a system that treated marriage not as a union of souls, but as a legal instrument designed to transfer wealth, secure political alliances, and produce legitimate heirs. The individuals involved were secondary to the transaction itself. And for those trapped inside this machinery, especially women, survival required navigating a labyrinth of physical danger, legal oppression, and social obligation that could end in death at any moment. The statistics alone should make us shudder. But statistics are abstractions. What happened to Margaret Beaufort was devastatingly real. In 1450, when Margaret was just 6 years old, powerful men began circling her like sharks around blood in water. She was an heiress, a child who controlled one of the largest fortunes in England through birth and tragedy. Her father had died, leaving her as the sole inheritor of vast estates, titles, and political influence. In the brutal calculus of medieval power, she wasn't a grieving child who needed protection. She was an asset that needed to be acquired before a competitor claimed her first. Her guardians, who were legally responsible for her welfare, saw an opportunity too valuable to waste. They arranged her first marriage to John de la Pole when she was 6 years old. Read that again. 6 years old. The ceremony was performed, the contract signed, witnesses recorded the union in official documents. Margaret stood there in a dress that dragged on the floor, reciting words she'd been taught phonetically because she couldn't yet grasp their meaning. She was legally married before she could read, but here's where the medieval marriage system reveals its true nature. 3 years later, when the political winds shifted and a different alliance became more valuable, that marriage was simply dissolved, annulled, erased from the records as if it had never existed. Margaret, now 9, was sold again, this time to Edmund Tudor, a man 15 years her senior, connected to the royal family and positioned to elevate her guardian's political standing. The marriage was consummated when Margaret was 12 years old. Not 13, not 14. 12. Edmund couldn't wait, or wouldn't wait, or perhaps didn't see any reason to wait. The law was on his side. The church looked the other way, and Margaret's body, still that of a child, became pregnant almost immediately. 7 months into her pregnancy, Edmund died of plague. Margaret, now a widow at 12, heavily pregnant and legally vulnerable, had to flee for her safety through a brutal English winter. She made it to Pembroke Castle, where she went into labor at 13 years old. Her confessor, a man named John Fisher, who recorded the event decades later, wrote that it was a miracle of God that a child could be born from so small a creature. Medievals speak for what modern medicine would recognize as a catastrophic obstetric emergency. Margaret's pelvis wasn't developed enough for childbirth. Her body hadn't finished growing. The labor was so brutal, so physically devastating, that it left her permanently unable to have more children. One pregnancy, one traumatic birth. Her reproductive life was over before her 14th birthday. She survived. Her son, who would become King Henry VII and found the Tudor dynasty, survived. But Margaret carried the physical and psychological scars for the remaining 57 years of her life. In her later years, as one of the most powerful women in England, she became an advocate for education and religious reform. Some historians believe her traumatic early marriage drove her to create institutions that might protect other vulnerable children. But that's speculation. What we know for certain is documented in letters she wrote, in the legal arrangements she made, and in the chilling gap in the records where more children should have been but never were. Margaret's story wasn't an aberration. It was just better documented than most. Across medieval Europe, the nobility operated under a system that modern eyes can barely comprehend without recoiling. Marriage wasn't about compatibility or affection. It was a legal mechanism for transferring property, and children were the currency. When Isabella of Valois, daughter of the King of France, was married to King Richard II of England in 1396, she was 6 years and 5 days old. Her trousseau, the collection of possessions she brought to England, included her dolls, not childhood dolls packed away as mementos, her current toys, the dolls she was still playing with. Also included were miniature silver furniture pieces made for a child's playroom and several illuminated prayer books with pictures because she couldn't yet read the text. The marriage contract, in what passed for medieval mercy, specified that the union could not be consummated until her 12th birthday. 6 more years of childhood. Sort of. Because while her body was theoretically protected, her identity was not. She was legally Richard's wife, her political status changed, her future bound to his. She attended court functions as Queen of England while barely tall enough to see over the table. The reasoning behind these child marriages was coldly pragmatic. Medieval Europe was a catastrophically unstable world. Plagues could wipe out entire families in weeks. Wars erupted without warning. Political fortunes reversed overnight. A daughter with a substantial inheritance was a ticking time bomb of vulnerability. If she remained unmarried and her father died, she became a ward of the crown or another powerful noble, who would then control her marriage anyway and claim the financial benefits. Parents, especially fathers, locked in marriages early to maintain some control over their family's political future. It was estate planning through human sacrifice. The children involved had no voice, no choice, and often no understanding of what was happening to them until it was far too late. But even if you survived being married as a child, even if you managed to reach your wedding day with some shred of innocence intact, what came next was designed to strip away any illusion of privacy or personal dignity you might have harbored. The wedding night in medieval Europe wasn't an intimate moment between two people beginning a life together. It was a public audit, a performance, a ritual so invasive and bizarre that it makes modern wedding traditions look positively restrained. After the ceremony and the feast, when you'd expect guests to politely depart and give the newlyweds privacy, they did the opposite. They escorted you to your bedroom, all of them. The women of the wedding party would surround the bride, remove her clothes piece by piece, brush out her hair, and put her into the marriage bed while offering explicit advice about her duties. Meanwhile, the men performed the same ritual with the groom. Once both were in bed, often wearing nothing but thin nightshirts or completely naked, a priest would step forward to bless the bed itself, praying for fertility and legitimate heirs. Then the games began. Guests would sit on the edge of the marriage bed and throw the couple's stockings at them. If you hit the bride or groom, superstition held that you'd be the next to marry. Imagine that for a moment. You're consummating your marriage while your family and friends are literally sitting on your bed throwing clothing at your face. For high-stakes political marriages, especially royal unions where the legitimacy of future heirs was paramount, key witnesses would remain in the room. Behind the bed curtain sometimes, but in the room. They needed proof that the marriage was consummated, because under medieval law, an unconsummated marriage wasn't fully valid. It could be annulled. All the political arrangements, the dowry payments, the carefully negotiated alliances could collapse if the couple didn't successfully perform their duty with witnesses present to confirm it happened. This wasn't just tradition. It was legal insurance. When Margaret of York married Charles the Bold in 1468, witnesses recorded details of the bedding ceremony that survive in archives today. The pressure on both parties to perform wasn't just social embarrassment. The stability of Burgundian-English relations literally depended on it. For a child bride like Isabella of Valois, even though her marriage wouldn't be consummated for years, the bedding ceremony still occurred. She was still publicly put to bed with her husband, still subjected to the ritual, still surrounded by adults treating her body as a political instrument, rather than that of a child who should have been playing with the dolls that were packed away in her trousseau. It took centuries for royalty to push back against this invasion. King Charles I of England, in the 17th century, famously barred the door to his bedchamber and refused to allow the traditional witnesses. It was seen as radical, scandalous even, because privacy in marriage was not a right. It was a modern invention that medieval people would have found dangerously irresponsible. But if the psychological trauma of a public bedding ceremony was horrific, what followed was often a death sentence carried out over years. Getting pregnant in the Middle Ages wasn't a joyful announcement. It was a medical emergency that would unfold over 9 months, and your odds of survival were worse than a soldier going into battle. Roughly 1 in 3 women died in childbirth or from post-birth complications. 1. In. 3. Let that number settle into your mind. Modern base jumpers, people who leap off buildings and mountains with parachutes, have better survival odds than medieval women faced every time they became pregnant. And noble women, the ones married to secure alliances and produce heirs, were expected to get pregnant immediately and stay pregnant until their bodies simply couldn't anymore. The medical care available was not just inadequate, it was actively harmful. Doctors practiced bloodletting during labor, believing that draining blood from a woman already hemorrhaging would somehow help. They used birthing chairs that were less about comfort and more about speed, devices that increased the risk of catastrophic tearing and injury. Midwives, who were often the most experienced and competent birth attendants available, were sometimes forbidden from attending noble births, replaced by male physicians whose medical training was based more on ancient texts than actual experience. Pain relief didn't exist beyond alcohol or herbs that were as likely to poison you as help you. Women endured labor that could last days with nothing but prayer and endurance. Eleanor of Aquitaine was one of the most remarkable women of the Middle Ages, brilliant, politically shrewd, and extraordinarily lucky. She survived 10 pregnancies, a feat almost miraculous in her time. Each birth was a gamble with death. Most noblewomen faced between 8 and 15 pregnancies, and each one carried a very real chance of fatal complications. Court records and letters from the era describe women dying in childbed as casually as one might mention the weather. It was not tragedy. It was expectation. Margaret Beaufort, the mother of Henry VII, was 13 when she gave birth to her only child. The labor was so brutal it left her permanently sterile. Ironically, that injury saved her life. She would never face the dangers of childbirth again. Countless women of her class were not as fortunate. Some died after their first labor, others after their 5th or 6th, their bodies worn out by repeated trauma. Infection, hemorrhage, eclampsia, these were death sentences in an age when medicine could offer no help. Even worse, women could not refuse. Marriage was compulsory, and under the doctrine of coverture, a married woman ceased to exist as a legal person. Her identity merged with her husband's. She could not own property, sign contracts, or appear in court without his consent. Even her dowry, the fortune her family sacrificed to secure her marriage, became her husband's property upon consummation. She had no rights to her body, her money, or her life. The law reinforced this subjugation through reasonable chastisement. which granted husbands the right to physically discipline their wives. The limits of reason were horrifyingly elastic. Courts sometimes acquitted men who beat their wives with sticks, provided the stick was no thicker than a man's thumb, a chilling origin for the phrase rule of thumb. A wife had no refuge, no legal recourse, no power. She lived at the mercy of her husband, and the law demanded her obedience. Divorce was nearly impossible. The Church, which controlled marriage law, allowed annulments only in rare, politically motivated cases. For most women, marriage was a life sentence, one that ended only in death. And, more often than not, death came in childbirth. This system of domination reached its most terrifying expression in royal marriages. King Henry VIII did not invent this cruelty, he merely weaponized it. When his first wife, Catherine of Aragon, failed to give him a son, he broke with the Catholic Church to annul the marriage. When his second wife, Anne Boleyn, also failed to produce a male heir, he had her executed on fabricated charges of adultery and treason. Under English law, a queen's adultery threatened the legitimacy of succession and was thus punishable by death. Anne's trial was a sham, her fate predetermined. She was beheaded at 35. Henry's fifth wife, Catherine Howard, fared no better. Accused of infidelity, she was executed at 19. 2 wives dead, 2 marriages annulled, 1 wife dead in childbirth. Henry's record was monstrous, but perfectly legal. The message to women was unmistakable. Your husband is your master, and your survival depends on his mercy. Beneath this legal violence lay another form of exploitation: money. The dowry system was institutionalized extortion. A dowry was not a gift, but a payment: cash, land, or privileges transferred from the bride's family to the groom's. Families went bankrupt assembling dowries large enough to secure advantageous marriages. A poor dowry meant poor prospects. A daughter might be condemned to spinsterhood, social exile, or a humiliating match beneath her station. Yet once paid, the dowry was gone. If her husband squandered it or abused her, her family had no legal claim to recover it. For the wealthy, dowries could be astronomical. Princess Isabella of Valois' dowry, part of a peace treaty between England and France, required years of installments. Margaret Beaufort's inherited fortune made her one of the most valuable brides in England, and that wealth was her shield. It made her too useful to destroy. But for every woman like Margaret, thousands vanished into marriages that consumed them. Even survival offered no comfort. Medieval marriages rarely ended in divorce. They ended in death. The average marriage lasted 15 to 20 years, not because couples drifted apart, but because one of them died. Husbands perished in war or from infection, wives in childbirth. Widowhood was perilous. A woman had to remarry quickly before her property was seized or her means ran out. Church records show people marrying 2, 3, even 4 times. Marriage was not romance, it was survival. In such a world, love was a luxury few could afford. Emotional detachment was a form of self-protection. To love deeply was to risk devastation, because death was always near. The modern idea of marrying for love would have seemed absurd, dangerously naive in a society where every relationship was a negotiation of power, property, and survival. So why remember this? Why dwell on centuries of cruelty and suffering? Because every freedom we take for granted today was built on their endurance. The freedom to choose who you marry. Revolutionary. For most of human history, that choice did not exist. The privacy of your wedding night, unthinkable to families who demanded proof of consummation. The safety of childbirth, an achievement born of science and sacrifice. The recognition that you are a legal person, not your spouse's property, granted only within the last century, and above all, the ability to marry for love, the most radical freedom of all. Our ancestors married to survive. We marry to choose companionship, equality, and joy. Margaret Beaufort lived long enough to see her son crowned king. In her later years, she devoted her wealth to education and faith, founding colleges that still exist today. Her portraits show a face marked by endurance rather than triumph, the look of someone who lived through horror and resolved to make something better. Her world is gone, but its shadow lingers. Every right we enjoy, our safety, autonomy, and choice, was bought with the suffering of women who never had them. Remembering their lives is not an exercise in pity, but in gratitude. The next time we romanticize the past with its castles and chivalry, remember the price women like Margaret Beaufort paid for our present. That is not nostalgia. That is progress. And it is worth protecting.